You want to go first?
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. As I said, I'm Adrienne Kotula, the Virginia Director with the Chesapeake Bay Commission. I did not prepare a PowerPoint because from my perspective, I want this to be a very informal discussion type of event. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you guys happen to have any along the way. I'll tell you a bit about my background and then give you some information on how I feel like my career has evolved to be much more kind of climate sustainability focused through the past 15 years or so. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Bay Commission, we are actually a signatory organization to the Chesapeake Bay Agreement. So we, along with all of the states in the watershed and the federal government, are committed to restoring the Chesapeake Bay and meeting all of the goals in the agreement, which include climate resilience, water quality, oyster restoration, land conservation goals, anything and everything you can think of. The commission is unique in that we are a legislative body. We're a tri-state legislative commission. So I'm technically a legislative branch employee in Virginia. And I focus primarily on, the policies, the regulations, et cetera, that my specific members are interested in achieving for the Bay. So in the last few years, that has involved anything from, helping Virginia set up a more nature-based, resilience-focused programming for the Commonwealth, to environmental literacy positions at the state, boosting environmental literacy grants, agricultural program funding and sustainability. I spend a lot of time dealing with regulations on blue crabs or striped bass, comparing what that looks like across states, et cetera. But how I got into this work specifically was initially, working for local governments on their Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act programs, which is very focused on riparian buffers. And then slowly, evolved in that role into working for the state government and assisting local governments in their programming. And then ultimately I wound up at an environmental nonprofit doing that type of work, helping local governments with their programming, but then slowly but surely evolving into the state policy space and the state legislature, but also federal government advocacy and supporting all of the Chesapeake Bay efforts that exist at the federal level. There's an entire office at EPA focused on the Chesapeake Bay, and we work very closely with them in terms of not only meeting our Bay Agreement goals, but also, working on making sure that the funding for those programs exists and is flowing in the proper directions to the various, I think it's 12 different federal agencies that actually support the Bay restoration work. So we spend a lot of time, working at that level, very focused on money and how money flows, and those types of things. So that's been the evolution of my career personally, but also I think it's important to note kind of the larger, I want to say generational shift almost that's happening in terms of the focus of our work. So as I said, originally, I was very focused on riparian buffers, the benefits of those buffers, the local government programs for those things. But through time, what I've really noticed is there's less of a focus on the specific regulatory programs, but more of a focus on the larger policy landscape as it relates to climate change and the policies that every government entity need to have in place to address those things. That's currently something that we're struggling with in the Commonwealth, and I know Jay can talk about this as well, but we worked to develop a work group for Virginia that is looking specifically at how the state can can govern not only internally, but help local governments externally deal with the large landscape of issues that come along with resilience. So, you're not only talking about flooding, which so much of us water people spend a lot of time focused on flooding, but there's also the energy aspects of resilience, which I know some of you guys are probably better experts than I am on, but also, the social aspects of resilience. And if you happen to live in these communities that are recurrently flooding or experiencing other impacts, how do we properly, as a Commonwealth, support them? So I spend a decent amount of time looking at that, but then also in terms of the long-term resilience of the programs we've set up for the Bay as well. How can we make sure that those are properly meshing with these new programs we're setting up for resilience? I've seen a lot more focus through time as well, in urban areas in particular. Again, kind of that shift away from the specific regulatory program, the specific stormwater permits that they have, but more into how can we make sure our urban communities that are, experiencing heat island effects, how can they become more resilient with planting trees? How can the state develop programs that support localities in doing that, support nonprofits in doing that? All of that realm is kind of what I'm seeing shift through time. And I'll be very interested to see how that evolution continues and how we as a commission can continue to support that as well. So with that, I think that's all I have to share right now. And I'm happy to answer any questions or hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. If anyone has any questions, this is the time to ask now.
And you can feel free to ask out loud or drop questions in the chat if that's better for you.
I guess maybe I'll go in with one question here, and this is probably going to be for all of the speakers eventually, but I always wonder when you're trying to make changes or establish goals and new policies and things, I'm always curious about what is the mechanism by which you generate support from those who are otherwise opposed to these kinds of things. All of us on the environmental side, we're trying to make this go as quickly as possible, but obviously there's lots of opposition. So I guess my question is, do you have a means by which you try to engage folks that might be, quote, on the other side and try to win them over to supporting the work you're doing, Adrienne?
Yeah, so my job is very unique in that, I'm not that environmental advocacy organization. I'm technically a government organization representing my legislators. And so my legislators are bipartisan. I work for both Republicans and Democrats who come from, anywhere from rural Pennsylvania to Fairfax County, Virginia, to the Eastern Shore, to the Shenandoah Valley. So I necessarily, as a part of my work, have to work with all of those stakeholders from all of those different perspectives along the way. So I have very close relationships with some, what you would consider to be very conservative organizations, and also what you would consider to be more liberal organizations. And so I try and stay in contact with all of those stakeholders regularly and make sure that there is that information exchange happening as an integral part of my work. So, it's that communication, engagement, and, there's still going to be issues that pop up where all of us are on opposite sides of issues. It's almost like this triangle, where Adrienne almost winds up as the midpoint of things, making everybody unhappy. But that's how I know I'm doing my job. So I'm sure there are different perspectives on that from our other panel members too.
Thank you so much for sharing. We have a question in the chat from Morgan asking, when we're saying urban, how is that being defined? I guess specifically to water issues.
So for me, specifically to water issues, I essentially define urban as something that is under a municipal separate stormwater permit, which is a census defined urbanized area. So that's where you get into your kind of regulatory realm and definition. Yeah.
I have a question. When we're talking about urban water quality, then do you think it's better to have a, I don't want to say top down versus bottom down approach, but do you think to improve water quality and stormwater management, would it be best to have in our urban areas either natural ways to help not purify and protect against storm surges, or more man-made structures, so like better water quality, like treatment facilities, and I guess seawalls being built, as opposed to, I guess, the more natural stuff?
Yeah, so there was actually a really great article this morning about the new flood wall in Norfolk that's being funded and proposed, that Jay was actually quoted in several times. And so if you, I'll link to this article that I'm talking about here in a second, but you know, it's one of those situations where I think you have to manage it from both sides. So you are going to have those huge catastrophic hurricane events like this flood wall is being proposed for, but you also have to have those natural and nature-based solutions. You also have to have solutions for that daily recurrent flooding that is going to impact quality of life of everybody. And I think I'm, again, this is where I hit that middle of the road approach, you know, where you have to be holistic in addressing things. I think localities need to work closely with their local stakeholder groups, their local community representatives, in finding the solutions that work for them. I don't know that is being done successfully anywhere as of yet. So I think that's something we'll need to focus on moving forward.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Adrienne? If
I have a quick question. I was just wondering, when it comes to water quality in urban environments, what's sort of like the worst or like the biggest pollutants that you see show up, or yeah, kind of what are the biggest threats to water quality?
You know, I think it's slightly different place to place. Obviously, there are certain areas where industrial stormwater and the toxics, the emerging contaminants, those types of things are going to be a really primary concern. I think other areas, you know, it'll be anything from bacterial contamination just because of, you know, a heavy wildlife load to, you know, I live in the watershed that drains the Willow Lawn shopping development in Richmond. There's a lot of trash that goes into that watershed, you know, a lot of just parking lot contaminant runoff. So it's very locally dependent, but I do think there are a lot of different avenues that there is still room for improvement in each of those realms.
Okay, amazing. Are there any other questions from anyone? If not, I think we can move on to Kevin's presentation.
Cool. Let me share my screen really quick. Get myself set up. Let's see. Can you all see that? Can you all see that?
Yep.
Awesome. So my name is Kevin Cianfarini. I am a representative of Beyond Methane RVA. We are a exclusively volunteer organization seeking to raise awareness about Richmond's methane gas problem. I was invited here today to speak about urban air quality. We'll touch a little bit on that, but I'm going to use this opportunity to push the bounds a little bit on the problems that methane poses, specifically to Richmond, but also everywhere. So when I say Richmond's methane gas problem, I want you to think of Richmond Gas Works. And for those in the room who are not familiar, Richmond Gas Works is a municipally operated fossil fuel natural gas utility. Methane gas is sometimes referred to as natural gas. And this is an issue because effectively, regardless of whether or not you have a gas connection in your house or if you are a customer of Richmond Gas Works, if you live in Richmond or if you are serviced by the Department of Public Utilities in any form or fashion, you are effectively a shareholder in a financially struggling fossil fuel utility. And that's just sort of the broad landscape I want to paint for you here. We'll dive into that in a little bit. But let's back up for a second and kind of ask ourselves, what is Beyond Methane doing to raise awareness about the issues that methane poses? And we've been looking at this problem for quite a while, but back in February of 2023, our organization with grant money from the Sierra Club bought its first methane sensor. And that's what that yellow doodad is up there in the corner. And all a methane sensor is a device that tells us basically how much methane is concentrated in air at any given location. So it's really useful for finding gas leaks in particular. And we took that and we brought it out to the west side of Richmond. And the very first place we checked had something called a 100% lower explosive limit reading. And it sounds scary, and it is scary. And what that means is that particular spot was leaking so much gas that it could ignite and combust in air. So that lower explosive limit, once you meet 100%, the reading doesn't go higher than that, but it is liable to burn in air. And this was concerning to us. And as a result, we filed something called a Freedom of Information Act request against the Department of Public Utilities, requesting all of their known gas leaks in the Richmond Gas Works service area that have not been mitigated. And the reason I say Richmond Gas Works service area and not in Richmond is because Richmond Gas Works services more than just Richmond City. We also service Henrico County, Chesterfield County, and some other odds and ends. And in partnering with the Geospatial Analysis Lab from the University of Richmond, we've mapped out 910 known and unmitigated leaks by Richmond Gas Works, and 2/3 of them are in the counties and not in the city. And the reason I call this out is because these leaks, the burden to repair these leaks is disproportionately placed on city residents, not on county residents. And that's a theme I want to revisit a little bit later. But since we've had our methane sensor, we've actually bought an additional one. Volunteers from Beyond Methane have personally identified 164 leaks, many of which were not previously known to the Department of Public Utilities. We have triaged those appropriately. But of those 164 leaks, 25 of them are that 100% LEL threshold. So again, that means 25 of these leaks can ignite and burn in air. And this, of course, poses problems for climate and air quality. I have a feeling I'm preaching to the choir that methane, or even combusted methane when it turns into CO2, is really bad for the climate. But one sort of sticking point we're finding to be really resonating with people of all shapes, sizes, and colors is, excuse me, I have to back up for a second. If we look at some of the data that we got from Richmond Gas Works, we know that they take about 245 days to repair any given leak. So that's about 8 months, and that's a really long time. So during that entire time, we're leaking gas, bad for the climate, like I was saying. But the problem that we're finding is really resonating with people is that this is a waste of money. The way Richmond Gas Works is set up means that customers of Richmond Gas Works are paying for leaked or lost gas. So Beyond Methane estimates that between 2012 and 2022, Richmond Gas Works has leaked $47 million worth of gas. But it's worth noting that these leaks are getting more severe and more common. In 2022 alone, we've estimated that we've leaked $16 million worth of gas. And this is where I want to pause for a second and talk a little bit about economics. This is where I'm going to push the boundaries of urban air a little bit. And I want to acknowledge the fact that this is a really nuanced and complicated subject. There should be time for questions at the end, but if you have questions you would like to follow up with after this presentation, you can email us at info@beyondmethanerva.org. So before we get into some of the nuts and bolts of this, I want to paint a broad picture. Utilities require lots of money to do things. It could be an electric utility, it could be a gas utility, or a water utility. Generally speaking, they require hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of upfront investment before they can provide a public service good. So in the case of Richmond Gas Works, they required hundreds of millions of dollars to lay pipes in the ground before they could really service anybody. And we actually have some of this information from the Energy Information Administration from the federal government. And in 1997, the historical investment into Richmond Gas Works infrastructure was about $200 million. But more recently in 2021, that's shot up all the way to $760 million. And as such, I want to take a moment and appreciate that they're adding lots of new customers. In 1997, we had about 90,000 customers, but more recently in 2021, we had about 120,000 customers. And I want to take a brief minute and pause here and reiterate that we don't just service city residents, we also service county residents. And part of this is a problem because as we're servicing more and more county residents, we're laying more pipes in the ground. These pipes are liable to leak, and we're laying more miles of pipe per customer in the counties or in sparsely populated areas than we are in cities. So if we've invested an additional $560 million and we've got an additional 30,000 customers, surely we must be selling more gas. But we're not. We see no evidence of that. Again, from data from the Energy Information Administration, the amount of gas we sold in 1997 is almost exactly the same as the amount of gas we sold in 2021. And this is an issue because if we're accruing all of this extra debt, specifically an additional $560 million of debt, but we're not selling more gas, we have to recoup that money somehow. And that's sort of one of the pivotal concepts I want to bring up. The rates you pay on your utility bills, certainly in Richmond, but this is almost a universally applicable concept, is directly related to how much debt a utility holds or how much investment into their infrastructure. And we can actually see this reflected on people's bills. And I want to break down this graph for you for a second. The yellow area represents the cost on somebody's bill for buying gas. And the orange area represents the cost reflected on somebody's bill just to connect to the system. And this graph is specific to Richmond Gas Works, but in the year 1997, an individual hooked up to Richmond Gas Works could expect to spend about 37% of their bill going towards infrastructure costs. And these infrastructure costs are things like paying back debt or paying for pipes in the ground. But more recently, as we've been expanding further into the counties and as our infrastructure and our system has been crumbling, these costs have been rising. So in 2021, Beyond Methane RVA has calculated that 63% of a given bill can be expected to go towards infrastructure costs. And the thing to call out here is people are paying for something that is not a tangible good. They don't know what they're getting with this. They're not seeing the purchase reflected in gas they've burned in their homes or their buildings. And the Department of Public Utilities has actually acknowledged this as well. In a rate filing to the Government Operations Committee in March of 2023, they claimed that they have to raise rates because per capita consumption is down and DPU's costs are fixed. When they say that the Department of Public Utilities costs are fixed, what they mean is they have a bunch of debt that they have to pay back, and they're not earning as much revenue. And we can independently verify this claim as well with Energy Information Administration filings. Between the year 2000 and 2021, per capita consumption of gas is down 37%. And that is not good for the finances of a utility that requires steep upfront investment. And then there's one other elephant in the room that I want to address, which is we have this $760 million investment sitting beneath the surface of our city. And this investment requires replacement or repairs. Like I said, we have 910 open leaks. And the financial problem with this is when you're replacing or repairing pipes, you're not generating new revenue. So you're investing a bunch of money into this system, which inherently does not net any more money. And therefore, people's rates have to go up again to cover the debt they're taking out to sustain this system. And this walks us into something that is extravagantly referred to in the utility space as a utility death spiral. It's a really scary term, really funny term. I'm going to walk you through it. So in Richmond's case, this we believe is being triggered by reduced consumption. And when I say reduced consumption, I mean reduced per capita consumption. So this can happen for lots of reasons. Rates can be high and people can be frustrated with it. So they might be consuming less gas. They might have more efficient appliances in their home. They might be disconnecting from the gas system altogether with the help of the Inflation Reduction Act. And then one, which is maybe not as apparent, is that we're putting all of this money into the system and the people we're connecting to the system are just never burning more gas, never burning as much gas as Richmond Gas Works would have expected. And when we have reduced per capita consumption and we've made investments to connect these people to the system, we're effectively losing revenue. And when we're losing revenue, because we have so much debt used to finance and build out this system, we need to raise rates. This debt is fixed. It does not change. And when we raise rates, consumption reduces again because people get frustrated and it becomes a very vicious negative feedback loop. And the thing to call out here is as consumption continues to dwindle, the people that are left behind on the gas system are what we like to call the rate burdened and late adopters. So the rate burdened is particularly the classification of people we empathize for. They're the people who don't have the financial latitude or the autonomy of their home to switch out their appliances for efficient electric appliances. And the late adopters are people who like clutch to their gas stoves for dear life. And the end result of this cycle, if it's left unabated, is a default on our debts in the Department of Public Utilities. And that's a problem. And the reason that's a problem, and the reason I mentioned early on, is that you're a a shareholder in Richmond Gas Works, whether you realize it or not, is because one, the Department of Public Utilities is owned by the city government, but two, the finances of Richmond Gas Works are commingled with the various water utilities that Richmond Gas Works owns and operates. So if we were to have a default on our debt for gas, it's well within reason to think that they would try and recoup those costs from water bills. So even if you're not connected to gas in your home, or even if your area of Henrico or Chesterfield is only serviced by water, you could expect to potentially be paying back gas debts for a mismanaged system. So the problems are really scary, and there's a lot of challenges to overcoming them. What can we do? Beyond Methane has been thinking about this for quite a while now. There's lots of solutions we're proposing and pushing the city government for. If you want to look at all of them, you can go to that link below. But the most poignant and topical one today is to instate something called a Public Utilities Commission. Almost every utility in the country is overseen by some sort of commission. Dominion Energy, for example, is overseen by the State Corporation Commission in Virginia. Richmond is an oddball in the sense that our Department of Public Utilities has no oversight. They report to City Council, and City Council generally does not know the nuance of utility operation. And therefore, we've had, as an organization, quite a hard time finding information about the operations of the Department of Public Utilities. For example, when we file Freedom of Information Act requests, sometimes that costs $3,500. So there's no transparency into the operations. Everything's very opaque. And instating a Public Utilities Commission would help alleviate this, as well as guide the trajectory of Richmond Gas Works. And this is actually a city ordinance that is put forward in front of the City Council and is going to be voted on July 24th. And this is something that Beyond Methane RVA is heavily putting their weight behind. And we hope you will too. I've said this before, but I think in the gas space, particularly for the energy transition, there's no lack of policy, there's a lack of political will. And what you can do today is you can exercise your voice and tell Richmond City Council that you care about this issue and you would like to see this legislation passed. And with that, I'll leave the floor open for some questions.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was really interesting. I guess I can start out with a question. How can we educate, I guess, the Richmond area about these issues happening right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So something Beyond Methane RVA has learned in practice is that energy is a really not salient concept. It's really hard to get people to pay attention to energy, particularly electricity and gas. And the best way we've found to get people involved and invested in this issue is pointing out that, hey, there's a pipe literally in your backyard that is leaking gas. And as a result, when we go out and we walk neighborhoods looking for gas leaks, if we find one, we'll generally leave a placard on people's doors saying, we found a gas leak in your neighborhood. This is bad because XYZ reasons. You are paying for this leaked gas. Here's what you should do about it. And we found that to be a very successful linchpin for getting people involved and to care about this issue and raising public awareness about it.
That's super cool that you do that. I had a question. I was wondering, well, I guess, could you go over the explanation of like the umbrella like problem one more time, like how it's connected to water? I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah, so the Department of Public Utilities in Richmond, to sort of get in the weeds of it, when they finance projects, both water and gas, they take out debt, and that debt is in the form of something called revenue bonds, and that's a type of debt that municipalities can take out. When they take out debt for these revenue bonds, they take them out jointly, sometimes for both water and gas. So like the financials of water and gas in Richmond City are quite literally commingled. So for whatever reason, if we're unable to pay whatever share of the debt belongs to the gas system, it's well within reason to think that the Department of Public Utilities would try and recoup those costs from water customers. And the reason for that is because if we were to default on these revenue bonds, for example, like if Richmond City were unable to pay back these debts, you don't really have a whole lot of options for remediation. Revenue bonds are quirky in the sense that they're not backed by taxpayers, they're backed by ratepayers who are the customers of utilities. But because all of this lives on the city books, if we were to default on revenue bonds, the credit rating of our city would tank, and then we would be unable to issue what are known as general obligation bonds, which are backed by taxpayers to do things like build roads and buildings and fund schools and fund city staff. So that's generally not an option, and it will require some sort of financial bailout unless we get ahead of this issue. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Kevin, I've got the same question I had for Adrienne a little while ago, basically regarding the City Council and proposing the Public Utilities Commission. I'm curious, what do you know about the opposition? What do folks that would choose not to vote for the commission, what is their objection to it? And then, of course, how could we bring them over to saying yes?
The opposition I've personally seen has been from the Department of Public Utilities itself. I haven't seen like industry opposition yet, and we're hoping it sort of just flies below the radar, if that makes sense. But the opposition we've seen from the Department of Public Utilities has generally been like, why would residents sit on this commission or customers of the utility sit on this commission? Why wouldn't like industry players sit on the commission? Like one thing we heard from them was that they would prefer a public utility commission be staffed by like Dominion Energy and Verizon. And as far as we're concerned about this, they don't really have a stake in this. Richmond residents and Richmond ratepayers do. And I don't know that we're going to be able to bridge the gap there. When these concerns were brought up by the Department of Public Utilities, City Council actually did a very good job of squashing those concerns, saying that like, you know, it's constituents we report to and like the ratepayers and stuff like that. So I don't know there's much we can do to bridge the gap there, considering we're sort of opposing the Department of Public Utilities conceptually, and like they're the ones who are going to experience oversight, if that makes sense.
So is it true that the city council members would feel the political pressure from the public utility operators and saying, you know, don't vote for this and all that? So is that where the influence is coming on the city council members themselves?
Yeah, we anticipate sort of 2 points of opposition. One of them is from the Department of Public Utilities itself, and the other one is from the city administration, which is guided by Mayor Stoney. The second has sort of yet to materialize. We're anticipating that. The former is sort of already materialized and I guess was deemed a non-issue by City Council. But it is worth noting that the formation of this Public Utilities Commission wouldn't be like the Public Utility Commission places pressure on City Council. The Public Utility Commission would be placing pressure on the Department of Public Utilities itself after formation, giving them guidance and stuff like that. Cool. If that's everything, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Again, if you live in Richmond or you are a customer of the Department of Public Utilities for Richmond, please sign that petition. It takes 5 minutes. We need people power more than anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. I think we're ready to get started on Jay's presentation now.
All right. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Jay Ford with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Thanks so much for letting me join you today. It's a wide open topic, but one that I think is really important. But when I learned about the makeup of this group, I got kind of excited at coming at this from a unique angle, and that is I'm going to share with you all a bit about how we at the Bay Foundation approach our work, but I'm going to really try and focus on some of the issues that will probably fall onto all of you in your future careers, because they're difficult questions that we're sort of wrestling with in their infancy right now, and will likely have policy ramifications in the years to come. So, and also I just at the outset want to say thank you to Morgan for your question around how we what we mean by urban. It's a term that I think is often misused when we're talking about environmental policy, and I think it sometimes becomes it complicates the actual answer sometimes, and that when we're talking about environmental issues, the commonality amongst groups usually has much more to do with socioeconomic conditions than it does whether or not they live in a built-out environment. Now, with the caveat that is, as Adrienne spoke of it, when we talk about water in the urban environment, we're usually talking about how water interacts with a ton of concrete, a lack of trees, and what the hydrological outcomes are of that process. But when we're talking about environmental issues at large, I do think urban often hides some of the important conversations, in that some people are using it as shorthand for environmental justice, while other people are using it as a means to drive funds into a city, sort of regardless of who that might be benefiting. And so when we talk about it in the environmental movement, I really do prefer to be more specific and say, are we talking about environmental justice communities? Are we talking about what the Virginia Institute of Marine Science refers to as vulnerable communities, those communities that are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate impacts? I think it's more helpful, because we find that urban is not a great placeholder a lot of times for what we're trying to discuss. You know, a lot of times urban or environmental justice communities in an urban setting have far more in common with highly rural, low-income communities, in that they are both the location for disproportionate environmental impacts, that they are both the location of a underinvestment from their locality, because they really suffer from some of the structural inequities that are in place, like consideration of tax base when making policy decisions. So I think I just wanted to say that at the beginning and say thank you, Morgan, for raising that. I think it's important for everyone to bear in mind. So again, I am the Virginia Policy Advisor for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And so that means if it has something to do with policy, I'm usually involved. I do focus a lot of my effort, particularly on legislative outreach and administration outreach. So working with whoever's in the governor's mansion at the time, as well as the members of the House of Delegates and the Senate. But this time of year, we're in regulatory season, so that means working with a lot of the agencies around the state on either updated regulations or guidance, and how we get best outcomes in those work groups as well. So when it comes to the, we'll say, built environment, which is what I think we're talking about today, is water issues can fall under a couple of different categories. Historically, the Bay Foundation, we've had really three main sectors that when we were looking at water pollution, we've said, okay, there's wastewater, there's stormwater, and then there's agriculture. And these are the three major bins that we classify nutrient and sediment runoff. And we still use these to a large extent, but I think Adrienne sort of alluded to this earlier in her comments, and that's that these lines are becoming more and more blurred over time. And particularly now in the face of climate change, where climate change is really a fourth driver of pollution to the Bay. It has taken what is happening in each of these sectors and exacerbated those impacts through heavier rains, through warmer waters that is breaking down nutrient cycles, through waters moving their way further up along the coastlines and pulling back more sediment and nutrients. So now when we talk about the Bay, we really do have to consider climate change as this overarching and fourth category, because it has taken all of our assumptions about what Bay restoration looks like and really thrown them out the window. We have additional nutrients that were never modeled in previous iterations of the Bay Agreement that are the direct result of climate change impacts. And on top of what climate change is doing to water quality, just by all of, increased in duration, frequency of rain events, warming waters, more water. On top of that, there's this flip side of the coin, and that's how do we all respond to climate change? And how do particularly our built environments respond to climate change? And so I'm going to start talking about the resilience space for a second as it pertains to cities, because it has pretty profound consequences for what Bay restoration looks like in the future. And I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say how Virginia, how Bay states decide to adapt to climate change will very much dictate whether or not we meet our Bay restoration goals. And so let me unpack that a little bit, so make sure everyone's on the same page. You've got increased water coming up your shorelines. If you're a city like Richmond, you're on the river, you have many historic events of major flood events to look at, and really kind of catastrophic damage that have impacted the region. If you're down in Hampton Roads, it sits with you even more as the prospect of one of those direct hits from a hurricane. It would level parts of the region. There's no other way of putting it. So we're looking at pretty catastrophic economic, human health, and environmental impacts as a result of these major storm events. But then we have what we call sunny day flooding. And in Hampton Roads in particular, that's become more and more the leading issue. And that is where you can't get your kids to school because of there is just water on the road while the sun is out. Additionally, there are issues with people's yards being flooded, people unable to get to work during the day. So this kind of pernicious sunny day flooding has become hyper impactful. And so how the region responds to that can push us one of two ways. Historically, when we've had water, we've tried to get rid of it. If you think about stormwater planning in cities, people are like, how can I get this off of my street as fast as possible? And they've sort of been agnostic on where it landed, which is why we have a whole sector of pollution now called stormwater. And that's because we didn't really care where it landed. We just said, let's get it out of here. And so we created a system of funnels in every city to move it out of the city and into your local river as quickly as possible. In a place like Richmond, where we have a system that combines sewage as well as stormwater, that becomes very gross really fast, because not only are we moving the stormwater, but we're also moving along some poop. And so you all, if you're in Richmond, you get the benefit of occasional closures and when there's just human feces in the river. And so there are design, how we approach a problem has really profound impacts for the environment. And what we're trying to do with climate resilience and climate change is make sure we don't repeat that mistake, which is we tried to deal with an immediate concern. And in doing so, we created a host of other environmental issues. And so right now, there's really a couple of broad categories for approaching climate resilience. And one is what I'm going to call the old school method, and that is build a wall. We know how to use concrete. We know that concrete walls will hold water back. So there's a lot of folks that say, why don't we just start building walls? And if we do that, we'll be able to protect key infrastructure, and that will allow us to do business as usual, and climate change, it won't matter, essentially. And that is a very popular idea that's sort of integrated into government. I think it's in some ways structurally built into government, which I'll touch on briefly. And for folks in localities who have not, if you're a planner with the city, stormwater has always meant concrete. And so this makes a lot of sense. It's an easy thing for city officials to adopt without, any nefarious reasoning. It's just something they understand. And so we're also dealing with a little bit of a education and cultural gap. But the problem with this is, well, there's a lot. One, building walls are very expensive. The city in Norfolk is facing down over $2 billion in just one phase of this project. The price tag is likely to go higher and higher. And so it's not a sustainable solution for most localities. The city of Norfolk is unique in that it got sort of a windfall of funding that we cannot expect to be repeated throughout urban areas in the Commonwealth. And so whether or not you could even pay for this approach is a huge question at the offset. Additionally, because it's so expensive, the structural approach to resilience planning also leaves a lot of people behind. And so there is a massive equity concern when it comes to this. And we need only look at the city of Norfolk, where when they went through the process of what the Army Corps calls the benefit cost analysis, they decided to place the wall around the tax base that brought the city the most money. So even though we have a massive environmental justice community in parts of the city of Norfolk, the wall that was proposed stops before their communities. The wall that was proposed just so happens to go around some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city of Norfolk, as well as the business center downtown and a casino, and then stop short the moment you get into lower income communities. And again, I don't think there's no evil person at the Army Corps, but because of the structural approaches that are built into this process, specifically what's known as the benefit cost analysis, which takes tax base highly into account, these project recommendations are sort of spit out the other end, and they are almost always inequitable in their initial suggestions. Another exacerbating factor on equity and resilience is that a lot of our Black and Brown communities in the built environment, as well as in the rural environment, are on grounds that other people didn't want. They were not, post-Reconstruction, the lands that were provided to folks weren't the best. If you're in a rural community, if you go visit like all the old plantations around Virginia, they're always on a bluff. They're always elevated. And that's because as long as we have been, in this state, people have understood that you want high grounds because of flooding events and because of things like mosquitoes and the ability for your land to park. So, and similarly, you see patterns in the urban environment around redlining that not only were mortgage companies making a decision to stay out of communities, but these communities had already been located in low points, largely on purpose, because it was land that was going to be difficult to develop. So before we overlay any current conditions on it, a lot of our most vulnerable communities are located in the worst spots for climate change impacts. They are more likely to flood. In rural communities, they are having septic system failures at a rate that outstrips all of their neighbors because they're so low that the ground no longer perks. And so their basic hygiene systems are breaking down. And so the environmental community, we're trying to get our arms around the inequity that's just baked in to resilience and climate impacts. And in the flooding space, it's particularly pronounced. And it's something that we're scratching the surface of right now, but as all of you mature into your respective careers, you're absolutely going to need to continue pushing on, because a lot of this, again, is baked into our policies, procedures, and programs. I'm going to be mindful of time, so I'm going to very quickly and without warning jump topics just to make sure everybody is read in on the bigger environmental justice picture here in Virginia. So when we talk about environmental justice in Virginia, about 90% of what people are talking about is the built environment, urban communities, or whichever word choice we're going to use. There are representatives from rural communities, but even the board structure is not really built to take into account rural concerns. And there are some structural reasons for that as well. Like a big one is that most agricultural pollution is exempt from something called CERCLA or EPCA. A number of you would know it by its other term, which is Superfund. So the fact of the matter is that a lot of rural pollution just doesn't get quantified in the same manner as the pollution in cities. And because of that, it's always been a harder uphill task to bring environmental justice concepts and works and approach into rural communities. But Virginia, until 4 years ago, we had no reference of environmental justice anywhere in our code. It was like you weren't allowed to say it. And we very quickly tried to make up lost ground. So we passed the Environmental Justice Act, which brought environmental justice language that was largely lifted from the EPA regarding meaningful involvement in environmental decisions into our Code of Virginia for the first time. We also created the Environmental Justice Council, and we also created the Interagency Work Group on Environmental Justice, and this required government agencies to meet at a pretty regular basis to discuss how they could integrate environmental justice concepts and outreach into their respective agency tasks. So we saw a lot of progress very quickly. Unfortunately, we've sort of seen the brakes pumped in the last 2 years, and that's before some major questions were addressed. And one that will certainly fall to all of you is the concept of cumulative impacts. And this is an outstanding issue that Virginia was never quite able to get to, but put simply, cumulative impacts means that an entity could come up, say I'm a paper mill. These are always a popular one to beat up on. They could apply for a permit. When you apply for a permit in Virginia, you say, we're going to have X air emissions, X water emissions, and the X land impacts. And the Department of Environmental Quality looks at it and says, okay, these are all within the allowable limit to issue a permit. The problem is that Virginia does not look around that area and see how many other people they said could have emissions within that area. So each permit may be legally issued, but a community may have far more than the exceeded or than the recommended amount of pollutants because they have so many of these permits within an area. And this is largely what drives the environmental justice community concept. But until there's an accounting for cumulative impacts, Virginia has no recourse in the permitting process. And so it's a huge issue that we don't have a solution to right now. And in many ways really gets at the core of what constitutes an environmental justice community. I think I'm way over on my time, so I'm just going to stop abruptly and happily answer questions.
Thank you, Jay, for speaking. You ended perfectly on time. We still have 10 minutes for a Q&A, so if anyone has any questions for Jay or any of the other speakers, please ask. Oh, before we jump into that, if Jay, Kevin, and Adrienne, if you would share your LinkedIn or emails in the chat so everyone can reach out to you when needed, that would be amazing. Thank you. And then, Gabrielle, I saw you have your hand up first, so go ahead and feel free to speak.
Sure, thanks. I really enjoyed hearing about environmental justice in Virginia. That's something that I've been really interested to learn more about. Something that I feel like is probably not, well, I'm just like interested to hear your perspective on, like, just by working for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and doing policy, like how do CAFOs on the Eastern Shore impact the Chesapeake Bay, and like what is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, or is there anything that they're doing to like work on that issue and agricultural pollution?
Well, you have hit on my favorite topic because I happen to live on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, so I can I could go on for a while, but the short answer is the pollution impact from CAFOs is much more significant than we previously thought. There's a number of reasons for that. One is that the amount of chicken houses in the watershed has generally stayed the same, but it's a bit of a shell game. So they used to be 20,000 birds, now they're closer to 50,000 birds. So same number of houses, but really twice the number of birds in the watershed. The second part is that we've got a better understanding of what happens with ammonia that comes out of the houses. And I mentioned CERCLA or Superfund earlier, and this is really, I think, a jarring fact, and that's that there are a couple of 12 to 24 house operations just in my county, in Accomack, and their ammonia emissions would all trigger Superfund sites, that they are so high they would fall under Superfund classification if it were not for the exemption. Their ammonia emissions outstrip all of the paper plants in Virginia. So it is this massive untouched source. But for those of you that don't know, ammonia, it really has a short lifespan in the atmosphere. It's very reactive, so it can do one of two things. It can either latch on to a fossil fuel emission, and it becomes more stable and moves its way into the upper atmosphere before eventually coming to a final disposition. Or if it doesn't find something to latch onto, it will settle back down into that environment in the form of nitrogen. So ammonia deposition and our understanding of it has increased a lot. And we now know that that makes up probably more than 16% of total nitrogen to the bay, which is a huge amount when you think about other sectors, like that's more than cars. So animal ammonia pollution is a giant sector. And just for the nerdy of you, here's a fun fact that we don't ever talk about in public, but because of the Clean Air Act work that happened, particularly during the beginning of the Obama administration, where we really saw air emissions start to decrease from fossil fuel sources, it's meant that animal ammonia is more impactful on the bay because there's less fossil fuels in the atmosphere to lock it up. So there's been this weird inverse relationship with these two, where fossil fuels used to be the dominant source of nitrogen to the bay from air emissions, and now it's animal emissions, and it's because these two sources are related. So fun fact, we fixed one problem and it made another a little more impactful on the bay.
Perfect, thank you. We'll go to Leah's question, and then I think we'll have to wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks. Jay, I really appreciated you calling out the cumulative impacts. That's something that we've been talking a lot about in the Climate Equity Working Group recently, because we've been looking at these air permit renewals for specifically the Darbytown plant in Henrico. And one of the things, this may be like too technical, it's definitely too technical for me. So that's why I thought I'd take the chance to ask. Most emissions from power plants are reported in tons per year or in kilowatt or tons per kilowatt hour, but air quality is reported in micrograms per meter squared. And that's like the public facing. That's what, if someone wanted to know what their local air quality was, that's what they would see. And I am having an absolutely nightmare of a time trying to convert those numbers into each other. So I just wondered if anybody had any advice for reading these permit renewals and being able to actually make sense of them in the way that the public would be able to use that data.
Yeah, I'm learned over the years to be smart enough to find smart people. And so when we want to make those types of conversions, we often look to folks in the public health schools. In the past, looking at certain emissions, we've worked with the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. They have some really fantastic staff and associated professors that can help in those conversions. And a lot of times, if it's an area that they're interested in, they'll do so in a formal way. which makes your presentation of the materials much more helpful if you can get that Johns Hopkins or whatever school of public health stamp along with it. So I would really recommend, and I think this is just good practice for in any environmental group, is go to academic professionals that you can take these materials to, because we may be able to develop shorthands. You know, I've read permits now for over a decade, and I generally know what they mean and could translate it to the layman, but it just sounds better if it's coming from the School of Public Health. And so a lot of times when we're fighting uphill battles, and we want to make sure that our credibility is really unassailable. And so I think it's important that we cultivate those relationships to help interpret data for folks.
All right. I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to everyone who was asking questions and just everyone who showed up. Once again, I dropped the link in the chat to the intern info sheet for anyone who wants to add to that, just so we can network. But yeah, thank you all for coming. We hope to see you at the next session, which is next week on Thursday, same time and place. I'll be sending out a reminder email. But yeah, I hope you all have a good rest of your day. And yes, as Titus just mentioned, we will be talking about Reggie next week. So stay tuned for that. All right. Bye, everyone.